In this section, we are going to discuss the U.S. sports structure. Here we're talking about various athletes at various ages and in various levels in the United States sports system. And what we really want to ask ourselves is, why are American athletes successful at the Olympic level, and how does that allow other people outside the United States to view how sports systems here in the U.S. are run? Because over time we're going to start comparing the U.S. sports system to sports systems abroad, and we're going to notice that there are differences in the way the sports systems are set up. So we may ask ourselves, who runs sport in the United States? If my daughter wanted to be an Olympic gymnast, how would she get there? What if she wanted to reach the top level in soccer or baseball or football? How would she get to those positions? And what would she need to know? And what may be some negative encounters along the way? The U.S. sports system is a complicated system of local, national, professional, and other leagues that may or may not be connected to an international sports system, complicating the route in various sports. This complicated structure can be explained by noting the absence of a coordinated system of governance. When we look at U.S. sport, we can see that there is no defined system that requires a league or program to follow a certain structure. If you wanted, you could start your own sport league, and you would not have to align with the NCAA or the USOC or another governing body. When we look at sport, what we notice is that there are very few laws that exist with regard to sport. Title IX, while not designed explicitly for sport, impacts gender representation within sport. We have the ADA, which addresses standards for how the public can and should be able to navigate through facilities and fields, but again, it wasn't designed explicitly for sport. Finally, there's the Amateur Sport Act of 1978, which is the only law discussed here that was passed in order to address and align amateur sport in the United States. This placed the USOC in charge of amateur sport in the United States. You can see the creation of this governing body, the USOC, by exploring the history as outlined here. Prior to 1978, the USOC worked to develop amateur sport in the United States. They developed a charter in which they created the idea of amateur sport and how it was going to be governed in the United States. But what we saw is that at the time, prior to the 1978 Amateur Sport Act, is that there were multiple amateur sport systems that were contending to run sport in the United States. So we can ask ourselves, why did the USOC win out in terms of amateur sport when other associations like the AAU were present? What we notice is that there was frustration growing with the lack of success at the international level, the lack of inclusion of female athletes, and the lack of the financial structure for amateur sport prior to the Amateur Sport Act. In 1963, USA Gymnastics formed as a feeder program to try to help compete at the international level. In 1968, the Wrestling Federation was formed as an independent governing body, and they refused to recognize the AAU as the umbrella organization in which they were under. And then we saw the International Track Association formed, looking to make money off of sporting events. So we see in the 60s and early 70s this drive to start to define who is going to run amateur sport. And what we see is that Amateur Sport Act designated the USOC as being in charge of sport in the United States. The focus of the USOC in sport-related matters have left local and amateur sport out of the loop in many cases. The focus here we tend to see is on that Olympic level sport. And as compared to other countries, what you'll notice is that that focus doesn't necessarily require attachment to the lowest levels, to the local level of sport. So you're not necessarily seeing funding that's required to get down to the local levels, which might happen in other countries that we talk about. So again, the NGBs are focused on success and development of the next generation of athletes, and in some cases that does address youth sport, but we really do see that the focus of U.S. sport at the national level is on those Olympic level or potential Olympic level athletes, which leaves a rather uncoordinated system at the United States local levels. While we did see the U.S. government step in and address the governing body for amateur sport by naming the USOC in charge in 1978, we have seen kind of a lack of enthusiasm for federal oversight over sport in the United States. As mentioned previously, few laws are present that impact sport, with some of the laws that impact sport not having that intention specifically, such as the ADA, which governs how we manage the fields. The American ethos allows for this argument to keep government out of sport governance. We like this idea of individual actors operating within the free market, getting the optimal outcomes. So it's essentially if you want to start a sport organization and people are willing to pay for it, then we as a United States system argue that that should be allowed to happen. Because we're founded in this notion of commercialism, capitalism, and market-driven economies. And these are what we see in terms of U.S. sports systems, in which if a sport is able to garner support and people are willing to pay for it, we see that sport continuing on. This will be different than other countries where we see a lot of support at the national level for trying to encourage different athletics. Here in the United States, we really have this individual free market will related to that. So if we say that the federal government isn't running American sport, meaning that the U.S. government isn't setting aside a certain amount of money and saying this is how it needs to be spent within sport, the question is who actually is. We have this idea of shared governance between federal and state governments, meaning that the United States will have some sort of say, but then we have laws that reach the state level, and then in our case, when we talk about sport, the focus on that local level. So if the federal government isn't going to take up the mandate, then the states have the opportunity to take up the mandate to control sport, and in this case, maybe just youth sport. But when they choose not to, that's really left to the local levels to make the decisions regarding sport. So we're going to look at that idea of that model, and we see a hierarchical model in which the national government makes decisions, and then the states or the territories in different countries will make decisions that then impact the local government. But what we see in the United States is kind of what you might be used to, where any program that wants to run in a particular area can do so. So a question that we might have is who else is responsible for sport in America? And while you don't have to know all of these national governing bodies, it's good to be introduced to the various components that are out there. So we have various governing bodies such as NERSA, which looks at collegiate recreation. So if you're involved in any of the recreational sport programs, you might interact with people who are relevant within NERSA. We also have things like professional leagues, Major League Baseball, the NFL. We can see local youth programs like Upward, the YMCA. We also see national governing bodies such as the NCAA or the National Federation of High School Athletics. So there are lots of different entities involved with working with these sport governing organizations and the sport governing bodies. And what this leaves us is a really complicated system in which we have the USOC as essentially the potential top leader within our amateur sports system specifically, but there are very few required connections between the USOC and other governing bodies. So if you look at this image right here, what you see is that the national governing bodies are required to support, work with, and associate with the USOC. But outside of that, a community sport organization like the YMCA might choose to align with the USOC, might choose to align with a national governing body, so maybe they want to be part of USA Gymnastics, but there's no requirement that they run a gymnastics program that aligns with each of these different systems. So they might find ways to support. Maybe they want to learn about coaching techniques. Maybe they want to understand a little bit more deeply about how they can train athletes properly. So they might align in some ways with the USOC, but there's no requirement. You'll also see here in the in this image that we have something like professional sport down on the lower right that isn't necessarily aligned in any particular way with the USOC. Although you will see maybe something like the NFL teaming up in some ways with USA Football. So there are movements that are being made within these governing bodies, but what we see and what we really see here is this really complicated system here in the United States. And this is going to, once we start comparing it to other countries, you're going to see the huge differences that the United States has in terms of how they run sports compared to other countries. There are obviously consequences to this uncoordinated governance system. There's no definable pathway to excellence for athletes, as eligibility and competition rules can and do differ depending on the country. There are ways in which entities such as the USOC are trying to help align people with the direction that they need to go, but there's no clear pathway for all athletes. We also have a very clear focus on results-based outcomes instead of a process-based focus, meaning that we're really focused on the idea of winning as opposed to everybody developing and learning the skills. We put sport in the American school system, which is pretty unique when we look around the world. We also, as a society, tend to value spectators as participants. So we see a lot of declines in the number of people who want to participate past school age. And there aren't any particular entities that are really truly responsible in taking control of the recruitment, retention, and development of athletes. So again, I started this lecture with asking you what I would do to get my daughter into USA Gymnastics, into the highest levels, and I'm sure that you could tell me, each of you could tell me different ways in which she could be at the top of the sport that is of interest to you. I want to leave you with this quote about understanding sport. As you can see here, there's an argument being made about looking at sport through a narrow lens of sport media or executives. Instead, what I would do is challenge you in this course to consider the broader impact of sport on various ages, demographics, communities, and the like, in order to really consider the entire sports system and not just the privileged side of sport. So we'll take a chance to do that both here in the United States and abroad, and I would challenge you to keep thinking about what does sport mean besides what I see on television.